So, good afternoon everyone. It's time now to continue our series on the book of Revelation. And we're in Revelation chapter 11 and up to verse 18. And I'd like to welcome you all today because we're studying into deep truth from your word, and it's very challenging to us that we can understand these things and to turn to the Lamb of God, which takes away the sins of the world. So this is number 15 in our series, and let's go to Revelation 11 verse 18 and take up this verse again. And the nations were angry, and thy wrath is come, and the time of the dead that they should be judged, and that thou shouldest give reward unto thy servants, the prophets, and to the saints, and them that fear thy name, small and great, and shouldest destroy them which destroy the earth. So God's wrath is different to man's wrath. In Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9, God says that man's ways and man's thoughts are very low, they're very earthly, but his ways and his thoughts are as high above man's ways and man's thoughts as the heavens are above the earth. And so God's wrath is different. God's wrath is where he leaves those who reject him to reap that which they have sown. Now, as I spoke about last time, and we'll read about it now, in Matthew chapter 23, it brings out this point from the words of Jesus, who is the true representative of God's character. So let's go there for a moment and we'll read this ourselves. The book of Matthew and chapter 23. And this is when Jesus was talking to the Pharisees. And the story goes on, and he reprimands them for their hard-hearted ways and their deceptive ways. And then he comes to the point where he says in verse 37, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stones them which are sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathereth her chickens under her wings, and you would not. So he wanted to gather the people to himself to fulfill the mission that God had for the Jewish nation to the world, to bring the gospel to every nation upon the earth. But they wouldn't be gathered. Not only wouldn't they be gathered, but they determined to destroy the one who was seeking to gather them. And in this sense, they were rebelling totally against God. And their plan was to put him to death at the first moment they could. Then goes on to say, Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. So what Jesus was saying is that he was going to leave them. But he didn't leave them because he wanted to leave them. He left them because they put him to death. And he allowed them to do that so that he could be the saviour of the world in that way. But if they had been supportive of Jesus, he could have died for their sins in a different way with human support. We don't know exactly how that would have been, but it would have been totally different to what it was. So here we have this idea of God leaving them to themselves to reap what they have sown, because Jesus was God and man, but he was also the representative of the Father. And then he says, "For I say unto you, you shall not see me henceforth, till you shall say, Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord." So let's just for a moment read from the book Desire of Ages by my favourite author, Ellen White, Christian author. And she talks about this principle too. And this is found on page 759 of Desire of Ages. And it says there, God could have destroyed Satan and his sympathizers as easily as one can cast a pebble to the earth, but he did not do this. Rebellion was not to be overcome by force. Rebellion was not to become overcome by force. Compelling power is found only under Satan's government. The Lord's principles are not of this order. His authority rests upon goodness, mercy, and love. So this is the principle of God's government. Mercy, goodness, mercy, and love, and the presentation of these principles is the means to be used. God's government is moral, and truth and love are to be the prevailing power. So that is the method that God uses, truth and love. And that is why when Jesus spoke the truth, and he spoke it in love, it directly conflicted with the way of the Jewish leaders. It also conflicted with the Romans as well, because they were a kingdom of force, the strongest force in the world at that time. Now, when Jesus left the Jews to themselves to reap what they had sown, here is the results written about this in Matthew 22. And this is described in Matthew 22 as God's wrath. Just have to find our place here a moment. And this is talking about how God sent messengers, he sent prophets, he sent teachers to the Jews to teach them the way of truth. And they rejected them. And in verse 6 it says, "And the remnant took his servants and entreated them spitefully and slew them. And when the king heard thereof, he was wroth, and he sent forth his armies and destroyed those murderers and burned up their city." Now this is a picture of what would happen in the understanding that the Jews had of God's character. But it was not the true understanding as Jesus gave to them when he said, "Your house is left unto you desolate." So who is the king in this? The king who was wroth? It was God the Father. And it says he sent forth his armies. And who were the armies? They were the Romans. The Romans were the armies. And destroyed those murderers. And who were the murderers? The Jewish leaders and those who supported him. And burned up their city. And what was the city? It was Jerusalem. But how did this actually take place? Jesus said, "Your house is left unto you desolate." And in 34 AD, when the disciples were rejected in Jerusalem fully, at the stoning of Stephen, and the great persecution came, then the Jewish Christians. They went then to the Gentiles. And so in 70 AD, the Jews, who had become a very obstinate, self-centered people, rejected the Roman rulership, and they rebelled against the Romans. And God didn't interfere with that process. The Christians in Jerusalem escaped, as Jesus had told them to, when these Roman armies first surrounded the city. There was an opportunity to escape, and they escaped. But those who were against Christ remained in the city. And it was just a straight war between the Romans, who weren't following God, and so they didn't have God's protection particularly, except for those who were inclined towards God yet and hadn't made up their minds. But the Jews had obstinately rejected Christ and God at that time, and so God's protecting care was not over them. They had said, "His blood be upon us and upon our children." And so, when the Romans attacked the city, they prevailed, and I think about 1 million Jews were slaughtered in the city, and the rest were made slaves. So that was a terrible outcome for the Jews. So God's wrath is different to man's wrath, because God didn't make the Romans attack the Jews. He didn't work it out that the city would be burned. No, he mercifully tried everything he could to bring the Jewish nation under his protection as his people, but they wouldn't accept it. So the time of God's wrath is when people reach a point where God can do nothing for them. And because God is a God of love and mercy and goodness, then he leaves us to reap what we have sown. And that reaping is a terrible affair, because nobody can live without God and God's merciful protection. And so we read in Revelation 11 verse 18 that thy wrath is come at this time, and the time of the dead that they should be judged. We've talked earlier about that when Jesus went into the second apartment of the heavenly sanctuary, the judgment of the dead began, and this judgment will continue through into the 1,000 years after Jesus comes, and that will be the judgment of the wicked. But the judgment of the righteous takes place before Jesus arrives on the earth. And this began in 1844, so we know the time frame of when the nations were angry and when the wrath is coming. And this coming of the wrath of God, the withdrawing of God's power from the earth, meant that these nations who were angry with each other produced all these wars and all this violence, even until today. And that he shouldest give reward unto thy servants the prophets, and to the saints, and to them that fear thy name, small and great, and should destroy them which destroy the earth. So how does God destroy those who destroy the earth? With their wars, with their policies, with their uncaring ways, the destruction of the environment. How does God destroy them? Well, eventually, when men reject him, he leaves them to reap what they've sown. He allows the outworking of sin to take place because he cannot do anything more for a large section of the community of the earth. And then he concentrates on helping his people who are serving him. So in that sense, he destroys those who destroy the earth because he doesn't specifically protect those who are bent on evil and have evil, evil, evil only in their hearts. Verse 19, and the temple of God was opened in heaven, and there was seen in his temple the ark of his testament. And there were lightnings and voices and thunderings and an earthquake and great hail. So what is in the ark of the testament? It is the 10 Commandments. They are in heaven. They are a transcript or a written version of what God is like and what he wants his people to be like. And so we cannot ignore God's 10 Commandments. And from 1844 onwards, these commandments have become prominent and become known among God's people, and they have shared them with the people of the world as much as they have been able to. And so all of us come to know that there are commandments of God, there are laws, and God's law is a law of love, and that law of love is written in the heart of someone who is truly born again. He writes it in our hearts and in our lives. And so instead of being in that position of becoming either a beast or a lamb, the two things we talked about in the last study, instead of becoming a beast, because you grow up into being a beast, you don't begin as a beast, but you become a beast by your choices, or you become a lamb by your choices. And so if we choose to be a lamb, then we must be born again, and then we must grow into that Christ-like character. But to become a beast and a part of the beast powers who oppose God, then we don't have to do so much. We just have to go along with the crowd and to compromise and to seek for our own ways and our own desires of our hearts, and then we will be transformed more into the image of the evil one. But if we follow Christ and his attractive ways, his beautiful ways, then we become transformed into his image, and he will reshape our lives. So we won't talk about all of this in this verse because there's a lot more in this verse too. But we will mention, it says, and there were lightnings and voices and thunderings and an earthquake and great hail. And if you read Revelation 16, verses 17 and 21, and you read Revelation 6 and the final seal, you will find the same ingredients in both. And this is talking about the time just when Jesus comes, where there will be lightnings, there will be earthquake, and there will be hail, there will be thunderings. And these are to do with the comings of Jesus, and the elements of nature are in upheaval. But don't wait till that time to try and get ready, because it'll be too late. Now's the time to get ready for Christ's coming. So let's go to Revelation chapter 12 now. And this is talking about the battle between good and evil once again, but we hear much more about God's side of things in this chapter. And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. So if we go to 2 Corinthians, let's go there now. 2 Corinthians, we see that a woman is a representation of a church. And we'll go to verse 2. This is Paul speaking on God's behalf. For I am jealous over you with godly jealousy, for I have espoused you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ. So a woman is represented by Paul as a church here, and this helps us to understand the terminology and the symbolism of this chapter. So a woman clothed with the sun. When it's clothed with the sun, we know that the woman is clothed with the gospel of Jesus Christ, because Jesus is the Son of righteousness. He's the Son of righteousness as a Son of God, but he's also like the sun in a certain sense, and he arises with healing in his wings, as is shown in some scriptures. And the moon under her feet, and we think of the moon as being the Old Testament, which is a lesser light to the New Testament. The New Testament is the revelation of Jesus Christ, and that is what revelation itself is. And that is represented in this case, in this symbolism, as the sun. And the moon is represented as the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, it's a lesser light because they didn't understand God's character. They were tainted in their thinking by the way that the other peoples of the earth lived, so that they took up the sword, for instance, and they had multiple wives in some cases and things like that. So the Old Testament is not a clear light on the gospel to the extent that Jesus gave the clear light in the New Testament. And upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And these 12 stars represent the 12 apostles, the 11 who Jesus chose, and Paul, who was the replacement, in actual fact, for Judas when he committed suicide. So on this basis, the church was built. The church was built upon Jesus and the 12 apostles. It's the foundation that was laid back then. And she, that's a woman, or the church, being with child, cried, travailing in birth, and pain to be delivered. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Now we'll come to what these 7 heads and 10 horns represent more fully when we go further into Revelation, probably Revelation 17. We will try and define these things down to more of a detail and spend some time on this. and 7 crowns upon his heads. So this great red dragon is there, and his tail drew the 3rd part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the man-child, which was ready to be delivered, and to devour her child as soon as it was born. My scripture here is worn out, and I can't read the exact words, but that's the thought there. Verse 5. And she brought forth a man-child, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up unto God and to his throne. So this man-child is obviously Jesus Christ, and the woman is the church. And in the sense of Christ's humanity, the church brought forth the man-child. But of course, Jesus, in his divinity, was the author of the church in the first place. And the woman, or the church, fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. So we have this time period again, which recurs again and again in the scriptures. And each day is for a year. Now the man-child was Jesus, and when Jesus went back to heaven, then the apostles carried on his work. And this great red dragon symbolized Satan, who drew 1/3 of the angels out of heaven with him. So the great red dragon is Satan primarily, but the vehicle for Satan's work at the time of Christ was the Roman Empire, because Herod tried to kill all the children under 2 years in Bethlehem, but Jesus had already gone from that place. He already was on his way to Egypt. But that terrible work of Herod, who was an agent of the Roman Empire. And so in that sense, the dragon worked upon Rome, who was also a dragon as well, in this sense, and they tried to destroy the man-child as he was first born. And then, after Jesus grew up and died, the apostles carried on the work. The church was persecuted terribly by the Roman Empire. And it wasn't till much later that persecution eased a bit, when Constantine became converted, the Emperor Constantine, and the 326, I think, the persecutions really finished. But then there was persecution specifically against those who didn't go along with Constantine's version of Christianity. And so for those people, the persecutions continued. So the dragon, in this case, represents pagan Rome, the Rome of the Caesars. And then we come to this time prophecy where the church had to go into the wilderness, and it fled into the wilderness in 538, but mostly later than that, when the persecutions began by the Roman Empire continued, but it came under the leadership of the popes who mobilized the people under their influence, the various nations of Europe, to persecute the people of God, like the Waldenses, like the Reformers, like the Albigenses, and various other groups who submerged into the environment and kept quiet. The Mennonites, the Lutherans were all persecuted. Then later on, the Baptists, the Methodists, all these groups were hunted down and put to death during that terrible period of persecution. So the church went into the wilderness because the people like the Waldenses, who kept to the Bible teachings, retreated into the mountains, especially of Italy and of France, and into those inaccessible places where they were hard to reach. But they were hunted in those places and persecuted. And that went on for most of the 1260 years of papal supremacy. And then we go to verse 7. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels. So here we have an explanation of the dragon further. The dragon is a symbol of Satan. Verse 8, and prevailed not, neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceives the whole world. So do you think the whole world is deceived today too by the dragon? Yes, virtually the whole world is deceived today. But back then it was even worse. The deception was even greater because that was the dark ages. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. So where did they come to? They came to the earth. And I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now is come salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ. For the accuser of our brethren is cast down, which accused them before our God day and night. Now when was Satan cast down? He was cast out of heaven before the creation of man. But he was cast down to the earth when Jesus died on the cross and was raised in the resurrection. Because then, when the angels of heaven and the people of unfallen worlds saw what Satan did to Jesus, the great Saviour of mankind, the leader of heaven, then they no longer listened to Satan at all. They wouldn't have anything to do with them. And in that sense, he was cast down further so that he could no longer tempt the angels and the people in other worlds with his sophistries and with his deceptions and threaten them with force. So then we ourselves are in a position where Satan will concentrate on this earth. Verse 11, and they overcame him. This is the martyrs, those who went to their deaths on behalf of Jesus, who were burned on the stake, burned with fire, who were tortured to death, who were starved to death, who suffered in dungeons, filthy dungeons throughout Europe and other places as well. And this is man's inhumanity to man. This is a beast at work when this was happening. But they overcame him. They were overcomers, those who held fast their faith by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. And they loved not their lives unto the death. So they loved God more than they feared death. Therefore, rejoice, you heavens, and you that dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil is come down unto you, having great wrath, because he knows that he has but a short time. Now, we're living in a time when deceptive power is at its worst, and the multitudes are deceived by the deceptions of Satan in so many areas. And we're seeing this particularly at this time in which we live. And these deceptions of Satan are going to continue, but God's people will know what is truth if they follow on to know the Lord, if they make the Lord their source of strength. So he knows that he has just a short time. Verse 13. And when the dragon saw that he was cast down unto the earth, he persecuted the woman which brought forth the man-child. So he persecuted the church, and he has been seeking to persecute the church ever since. But his power was broken in 1798 through the papal power being diminished in power by the taking of the Pope captive. And then atheism arose, the beast from the bottomless pit. And it now has warred against God and Christ too since then. And we're coming to a point where this war is coming to a crisis. And to the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place where she is nourished for a time, times and half a time, from the face of the serpent. And once again we have a time period. 1 time equals 360. 2 times is 720. And half a time is 180. And so this is exactly the same time period of 1,260 years when the woman was persecuted in the wilderness. Okay, now verse 15. And the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. So the serpent, he worked on the people and stirred them up to attack God's people and to persecute them. And this flood was those who persecuted the people of God who were hiding in the wilderness. And God took them into the wilderness in a very quick way. Was given 2 wings of a great eagle. And there was a place found for the truth to remain. Verse 16, and the earth helped the woman. In what way did the earth help the woman? And the earth opened up her mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon cast out of his mouth. So when did this happen? It happened during the Reformation. During the Reformation, which began with Wycliffe in England. He was the morning star of the Reformation. Then it extended to Huss and Jerome and other leaders in modern Czechoslovakia, the Bohemians. It spread to Germany, not directly, but Martin Luther himself was given light in Germany, and he stood up for the truth that the just shall live by faith. And he identified the power, the persecuting power, as being a power against Christ. And he stood up for religious liberty, freedom of choice. He stood up in a great measure for love, even though he was not wholly a representative of Christ's love. But he was certainly on the track to that love. So the Reformation nations that gathered around Luther and Zwingli from Switzerland, and then in England, Tyndale and others, those who gathered around these figures that God raised up to spread the truth, they provided a place of protection. And because they had knights and leading men, kings who were over those places, who were disturbed by some of the things that the papists had done, the earth helped the woman by protecting the church within the boundaries of these places. And then, of course, many of those who were persecuted by the papacy and also by some misguided reform groups, they escaped to America. And even then, there was some persecutions in America of reformers against reformers because of a misunderstanding of God's character. But from America came liberty of conscience, freedom of choice in worship. And so that is the great foundation of America, which I would say is being lost at this very time. So then, verse 17 talks about the time in which we live. And the dragon was wroth with the woman, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God, and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So who is this remnant who keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus, as we shall find out later? They are those who are raised up in the Advent movement after 1844. They were given an understanding of by looking into the temple, and they saw there the 10 Commandments. They realized the truth that the Sabbath is the true day of worship. They came to understand more, thou shalt not kill. And so these are the people that at the end the dragon will make war against them, and he's gathering his forces to make a beast which will come against the commandment-keeping people. And this will be the subject of the next chapter. This beast which arises and brings us more and more into present day times. So next week we'll look at the next beast, and we'll see that there is a beast being formed. He's not formed yet. which will replace atheism as the main power in the world. But it won't be long and we'll see this beast in power upon the earth. He will be more gentle first, but then he will eventually speak more and more like a dragon. So let us become like Christ in character so that we are ready for what is coming. And we have a unique opportunity to be a member of the 144,000, which is spoken about in Revelation chapter 14 when we get there. Thank you.